Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Jeremy from Midtown Reader, an independent bookstore here in Tallahassee, and we're excited to have a great panel for you this evening. Jeff and Ann VanderMeer will be joined by actor Bronson Pinchot. We'll get into introductions in a moment, but first I wanted to let you know that you can submit a question at any time during the event using the Q&A button right at the bottom of your screen, and we'll leave a few minutes at the end for those. So just throughout the conversation, just put your questions in there and we'll get to them at the end. I also want to let you know that you can purchase Jeff's book, Ambergris, at Midtown Reader or at midtownreader.com by giving us a call or by stopping by. We're open for browsing Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 6, Sundays from 10 to 4, and Monday afternoons by appointment. We also offer delivery anywhere in Tallahassee, and we will happily ship anywhere outside of Tallahassee. And now I would like to introduce you to tonight's moderator, Ann VanderMeer. Ann currently serves as an acquiring editor for Tor.com and Weird Fiction Review, and is the editor-in-residence for Shared Worlds. She was the editor-in-chief for Weird Tales for 5 years, during which time she was nominated 3 times for the Hugo Award, winning 1. Along with multiple nominations for the Shirley Jackson Award, she also has won a World Fantasy Award, a Locus Award, and a British Fantasy Award for co-editing The Weird, a compendium of strange and dark stories. Other projects have included Best American Fantasy, 3 steampunk anthologies, and a humor book, The Kosher Guide to Imaginary Animals. Her latest anthologies include The Time Traveler's Almanac, Sisters of the Revolution, an anthology of feminist speculative fiction, and The Bestiary, an anthology of original fiction and art, The Big Book of Science Fiction, and The Big Book of Classic Fantasy, and The Big Book of Modern Fantasy. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ann.
Thank you, Jeremy. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank Midtown Reader for hosting this event. And let me introduce you to our esteemed panelists today. First, we have Bronson Pinchot, who is Audible's Narrator of the Year for 2010. He has won Publishers Weekly Listen Up Awards, Audiophile Earphones Awards, Audible's Book of the Year Award, and Audio Awards for an array of audiobooks, including Matterhorn, Wise Blood, Occupied City, and The Learners. Bronson has also done the audiobook for Jeff's novel Authority and the Ambergris books. A magna cum laude graduate of Yale University, he is an Emmy and People's Choice nominated veteran of movies, television, Broadway, and West End shows. His performance of Malvolio in Twelfth Night was named the highlight of the 2-year Kennedy Center Shakespeare Festival by the Washington Post. He attended the acting programs at Yale, Shakespeare and Company, and Circle in the Square, logged in over 200 episodes of television, appeared in films across the gamut from ultra mainstream to ultra indie, and has done plays, musicals, and Shakespeare on Broadway and in London. He creates rooms, entire houses, and occasionally gardens using the architectural salvage of pre-1840 buildings in as-found condition. Jeff VanderMeer's New York Times bestselling Southern Reach trilogy has been translated into 40 languages worldwide. The first book, Annihilation, won the Shirley Jackson Award and Nebula Award and was a finalist for several more. His Borne universe novels have been optioned for TV by AMC. His publisher, MCD-FSG, has just released Ambergris, a hardcover omnibus reprint of his 3 novels set in his iconic imaginary city of Ambergris, City of Saints and Madmen, Shriek and Afterword, and Finch. Drayton in Love and the Transformation of Martin Lake from City of Saints won the Theodore Sturgeon and World Fantasy Awards, respectively. And Finch was a finalist for the Nebula Award, among other honors. As a classic of the new weird movement, the Ambergris novels have been widely influential, but have never before been released by one publisher or in a single edition. The Ambergris books explore issues of power, colonialism, and history through a sometimes absurdist and surrealist lens, influenced by the decadent movement and Byzantine history, featuring the mysterious Greycaps, wars between rival publishing houses, conquest by pirates turned emperors, and extrapolation of fungal technologies that has predicted the work of scientists today. So now that I've done my introductions, I would like to start with this first question. I am sure that our viewers tonight would like to know what this year has been like for you both, and especially how or if your work and method of working has changed because of the circumstances that we're all living in right now. Bronson, you want to start?
Well, yeah, you know, audiobooks are a great way to make it through a pandemic because it is already isolated. You're isolated twice, once inside an audio isolation booth, and second, inside your author's imagination, at least. And then tertiarily, if that's a word, then you're self-isolated inside the listener's brain. So when you come out for a break, especially from something like Ambergris, you almost literally have vertigo if you come out to go to the bathroom or have an energy bar, because you're wandering these fungal streets and these fevered brains, and you're there because there's nothing to distract you, and you're and there's an engineer or there's a remote engineer, so it's a pretty good art form for the current times. I don't hear you.
How about you?
Sorry. An author is also kind of like a hermit, at least during the creation of the book. And the weird thing for me is I went on a full-on book tour in December of last year, and then went into total isolation. So it was even more, I mean, like literally a whirlwind, because in December of last year, of course, you have the holidays coming up, so all the events are clustered close together. So I saw hundreds of people, was doing all this interaction, and then suddenly, boom, nothing. and then in addition to the boom, nothing, suddenly it's an enforced nothing. And it's weird because even if you're a hermit or you're an introvert like I usually am, when it's enforced, when you have to do it, it's somehow much more claustrophobic, even though it's probably more or less the same thing I would be doing. And so I guess, it made me do more gardening around the yard. That's the only place I could go. I have to start thinking about things like, do I get rubber bands for the ponytail I'm now growing because it's not safe to get a haircut here. And I did actually finish a novel in part by channeling the claustrophobia and paranoia of the year into the situations in the novel, kind of method acting because they kind of fit. So, I'm still trying to process just how surreal this has all been.
Jeff, when you say that something is surreal, I get a shudder from my brainstem down to my toes. It reminds me that there was a wonderful book, Peter Ackroyd wrote a book about the history of London.
Yes, I read that. That's actually an influence on the Ambergris stuff. Yes, absolutely.
Incredible, right?
Yeah,
but
it is.
He said one thing in that book, which, as an actor, one is always looking for the sensory details because they're usually lacking, not in your work, but, when you do a play, you want to know what. And he said one thing that I'll never forget from that book. He said in the 16th century, there were people in London who were complaining to the authorities about bad odors. And then he said, imagine
what that would have
considering what that had to have been, considering that they lived with feces and vomit and dead animals right in the street. He said, it boggles the mind. I'll never forget that line. So when Jeff VanderMeer says that something is surreal, I tremble.
Well, I mean, I guess the other thing too is rereading the Ambergris stuff, for copy editing and everything. I was struck by how it's actually, with all the themes of contamination and spores and stuff, and they're wearing masks, it's actually, actually creeping me out a little bit because it felt more visceral somehow than it did before. So, Yeah, but that London, that Ackroyd thing is amazing.
Isn't it beautiful?
Yeah, and there's so many details from that and from histories of Byzantium and other things where, you know, some of the stuff in Ambergris, the accounts, like the weird historical stuff, is actually just like taken
Of
from real
course.
history, but nobody believes that I didn't make it up because it's so absurd, you know?
Well, also because the first time we ever get fed history, it's so edited and neatened as to be useless. So when you re-encounter history as a grown-up, it all seems too weird and fresh and visceral and smelly because they cleaned it up. You know, what's the point of cleaning it up? But anyway.
But also
Yes.
fun and entertaining. And you're right, because when you encounter it in high school and you have to study it, there are whole periods of history that I just stayed away from for years because of having to, you know, like you said, get the textbook version of it. So yeah.
Yes.
Well, Jeff, speaking of history, Ambergris is now out in this amazing edition. But when you were writing Ambergris back in the 90s, did you know that these books would have so many lives? It was a strange path from writing the books to publication. Why do you think these books continue to entertain readers? And can you talk about some of the publication history? Because I know that history is really strange too.
I'll try to keep this brief, and I also appreciate your professionalism as a moderator because you were there for all of the horrors that I'm about to describe. So I had a really difficult literary childhood, so to speak, in that I had a lot of trouble getting books published. I had no problem getting short stories published, but once I started writing novellas and novels, the editors were like, nah, we're fine with your crap when it was short, but now that it's longer, not so sure. So you know, I went through things like I thought I had a book deal for a short story collection, but it got held hostage by the bookbinder because it was a small press and she wanted all of the titles in the table of contents to read like a poem. So she wanted me to change the titles, which was the most absurd thing ever. But it turned out the editor was having some kind of relationship and he didn't want to upset her. So it was like I had to either do this or not take the deal. Anne remembers that quite well. I wound up not taking that deal. The first novel was, unbeknownst to me, represented by a children's book agent. She didn't tell me that she was a children's book agent, and it was for a novel that one reader, when it was published, called As If Saw Met Meerkat Manor, so you can understand why she never sold it. And then that same novel wound up being taken by a UK publisher, and the editor became a fundamentalist Christian between buying the novel and editing it, and wanted me to change a lot of the novel to fit the Old Testament, which, since it was a novel based on Greek myth, was impossible to do, so I had to withdraw that. So this was the context for me being extremely scarred by the time I was trying to sell City of Saints and Madmen, the first book in the Ambergris trilogy. And that didn't go very well either. I found a publisher, a very respectable one, that said, we're happy to publish it, but we would like you to change the setting to Paris around 1900 and take out all fantastical elements. If you'll just go off and do that, in other words, completely rewrite the book and change the storylines entirely, and then come back to us, we'll probably publish it. So I said no to that. And then also an artist friend of mine who ran a press wanted to publish the collection, but he wanted me to change the descriptions of the paintings in one of the novellas, Transformation of Martin Lake, so that because he wanted to do his own interpretations in his paintings, he wanted me to change it to fit his art. And since the paintings are very symbolic and they actually feed into the plot, again, I couldn't actually do this. So I withdrew the collection again. I finally found a publisher in the UK. Everything seemed like it was going to be going great. I'd won the World Fantasy Award. They just wanted to do a limited edition in addition to the regular one. And so they asked if I would collect money from fans and friends and family for a limited hardcover to kind of like, you know, be a hedge against the trade paperback not doing well, since it was such strange stuff. And so I did that, and I sent over the $5,000. And then I heard nothing for 6 months after having had quite a lot of communication. I finally kept pushing in emails, you know, what is going on, and I became a little bit, not threatening, but I was very irritated because I was concerned after all the other things that had happened to me. And he sent me an email finally, and he said, Jeff, I'm really sorry, but I've spent all of your money that you sent. I'm on my honeymoon, and I spent the money on my honeymoon and my wedding, and I'm really sorry. And so, and there's not going to be a book because I've decided to dissolve the publishing company. And so I pushed him about trying to recover some of the money, at least, believing him in what he said, that it was gone. And I started getting Hotmail account emails from his supposed lawyer, which I later found out was him pretending to be his own lawyer to warn me off. and then finally, through triangulation through other sources, I managed to pin him down to two things: returning some of the money. And then he also told me that he actually hadn't gone on his honeymoon, but that he'd had a nervous breakdown from all the people he'd screwed over, and that he had checked himself into a spa sanitarium and was receiving treatment for a nervous breakdown, but that he thought it would sound better if he said he was on his honeymoon, that I might be less inclined to want my money back for some reason. So needless to say, this book deal dissolved completely, and I only got about half of the money back, but at least I got that. And I just put the book aside and said, this publishing world is not for me, or it's not, one way or the other, this isn't working out. And I just forgot about it. And then luckily, like a year later, it's almost like when you stop putting energy into something, it comes to you. Prime Books came along, the first publisher of City of Saints, published it. It got all this acclaim, all these commercial publishers picked it up, and then the books after it. But for a while there, it most definitely, and this is the short version, there's a lot more horror there that I could explore. But definitely for a while there, it was pretty fraught, as you remember, Ann.
Yes. We survived, made us stronger.
Oh my God, that's
Did it make us stronger?
So
doggone.
Bronson, now I have to ask you.
Bronson, I think Bronson has a question or concern. Wait. He has do I see a question on your face or a concern, Bronson?
No,
The look of horror on your face.
I can see a picture of myself in the corner of the screen that's literally about as big as a thumbnail, and I referenced it once or twice because I thought I can tell that my jaw has dropped. I want to see what
true.
That literally organically looks like, because I know that I'm not trying to, but it's so relentlessly horrible that I want to see what it looks like. And I looked and I thought, yeah, it's over the top, but that's what jaw dropping is.
Well, Bronson, let me ask you, what has been your wildest project, whether it's a theatrical performance, an audiobook, a DIY project that you've been involved in that kind of can match what Jeff went through? Do you have anything?
You know, what comes to mind, there was I used to be pigeonholed when I first started audio. I don't know why. I was pigeonholed doing kind of younger people's fantasy, and that's okay. But I remembered one day saying to my engineer, there's a character here called Cuddle Bunny, and I think I'm going to have to put a gun in my mouth and blow off the back of my head. Anyway, as Jeff said, sometimes when you just let it go, there was an amazing book called Matterhorn, which was a huge epic set in Vietnam. And I got a call saying the narrator did 40% of it, and then he got a TV job. So can you jump in? And I knew it was a huge opportunity because it was a big, grown-up, heart-rending tragedy. The book, not my life then. And so I jumped in, but because of the time constraints, I had to read. You normally do 6 hours a day of recording. I did 14 hours a day, and I was not able to pre-read it. And I did it, and it was an astounding book. And once it came out, it put me on the map, so that today I get to do everything from VanderMeer to children's fantasy to anything. There's no holds barred. But anyway, there was a section in it where these young men were fighting to recover this hill, and it was doomed. And the lead character decides he's just going to fight his way up the hill anyway. And out of the blue, out from behind this boulder, jumps this character who's mentally handicapped, who he had been kind to, who covers him with fire, who he gives him covering fire and allows him to live. And then that character dies. And because I had not pre-read the book, I just burst out crying, and I crunched down on it and left it in. And a librarian or a bookstore owner wrote me a letter and said, I don't know what you intended, but when that character jumped out from behind the boulder, something in your voice made me burst out crying. Mm. So I sent the letter to the author, and he said, Bronson, that's amazing, because when I was writing it, I didn't know how I was going to save my lead character. And the character of the mentally disabled Black kid simply jumped out from behind the boulder, and I burst out crying. So the character, so I mean, the thing is, this imaginary character jumped out from behind this fictive rock, shocked the author into tears, shocked me into tears, and shocked the listener into tears. And nobody was in any doubt. Nobody in that food chain was in any doubt that the fictive character had created this moment. Isn't that amazing?
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting how a book can take you somewhere sometimes. It just goes where it's going to go, and you have no control.
Absolutely. It's just, I'll never forget that, ever. That was amazing, Well,
let me ask you another question, Bronson, because the Ambergris Trilogy and the Southern Reach Trilogy, both sets of books were written by Jeff VanderMeer, but they're totally different, as you know, very different books. How different was it for you to do the audiobook for Ambergris after you had already experienced doing Authority? How did you approach that with two different kinds of books, but the same author?
What's interesting is, I remember, I don't know if you've ever read, but, have you ever read Kafka? You've read Kafka.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and so Kafka wrote all these Kafka-esque books, and then he wrote America, which he said was his Dickensian book. And I remembered thinking when I delved into Ambergris that, well, first of all, they are alike in this. They are alike in this. I remember once shopping for my first historic home, and the one that intrigued me most was a little stone house that had been part of a mill, and you could sit on the front porch and literally dip your foot from the front porch into this very cold, refreshing little brook that ran by it. And that is what reading one of Jeff's books is like, because if you think you're going to be driving, you're wrong. But if you just sit on a stone porch and put a foot in, it'll take you where it's going to take you. So they're both alike in that. But I would say Ambergris, in the same sense that that America is Kafka's Dickensian moment, was maybe Jeff's Dickensian moment, far more so. I mean, because it's this big dirty city, and because it's teeming, and because it's the city is the star kind of. But that isn't what happens when you're reading a book. You're not really, you're only peripherally contemplating the style. What you're just doing is dropping in, like that little bubble that takes people down to the Titanic. That little diving bubble that goes, that it's pressurized, and they go down and they can see into you're going down into a diving bubble, and you're just going wherever the periscope takes you. So they both take you into, in both books, you went into a world and you focused the periscope, and as long as you look unflinchingly at what you're insisting one look at, they're the same. I found they're both extremely easy to do because the directions are so explicit. For the best, the thing is, Jeff had written me and said, I don't know how in the world you're going to do these footnotes in the one book, but he may have forgotten that the character says explicitly, I'm putting footnotes in basically to punish you, the reader, because if you think you're going to skim what I wrote, I'm going to force you to endure these footnotes, and that's your punishment. So I'm paraphrasing, which is a terrible thing to do in the presence of an author. But then I knew exactly how to do them. I'm going to. It's scholarship as weaponry.
That's great.
I like that.
And he says to the reader, I'm putting these in. I'm going to put in as many and as long and as complicated as I can, so that you don't dare skim an author of my age and experience. So I knew exactly what to do. And he's very explicit that way in terms of telling you what to do, which is nice.
That's hilarious. And I've forgotten about that too. Yeah, there's actually footnotes for some of the footnotes.
Of
at the
course.
beginning.
But this is the other wonderful thing. You know, there's two sublime ways to do exposition, and a lot of non-sublime ways. The two equally sublime ways are, number one, to do it like Heinlein does it, which is a nanosecond before you need the information, you get it.
Mm-hmm.
And literally a nanosecond. And the other way is the Duncan Shriek way, or the in many cases the Jeff VanderMeer was, is just literally just hammer it and say, you want exposition, baby? I'll get it. And it's like, both of them are wonderful because they make no bones about it. The ones where I start to bang my head against the door of the booth is where it says, Jeff opened his mouth to ask Bronson a question and instantly remembered his childhood on Oahu. And it's like, oh, no, that's not possible. He couldn't have, I know. That's
I do remember a book that I read. I won't tell you the title of the author, but where the main character walks into a church that reminds them of another church. So we get a flashback, but we never get a scene in the actual church they just stepped into.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is you got to like take the nail and drive it right between the eyes with glee, and very puckishly, as you do at times. You don't always, but when you decided to do it in this book, you did it just like a gleeful. At times I thought the book reminded me more of a Bosch painting than anything.
Oh,
just
well, thank you. I appreciate
Bosch,
that.
just Bosch people torturing each other in the most adorable ways. Or you just,
Can I quote you on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so Boschian. It just is, and it's puckish torture. I mean, they're just sort of playfully. Oh dear.
Oh dear, really? Yeah.
Well, Jeff, you and Bronson did an interview several years ago for Vulture, and at that time you were saying that you thought authority would be very difficult to voice, although Bronson did an excellent job. Do you think that Ambergris is more of a challenge?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the thing about authority that I loved in Bronson's performance is that coming off of Annihilation, the first book, some readers, if they don't give themselves a break, don't catch the dark humor in the second book because they're expecting it to be the same mood as Annihilation. And what I thought was so great about the audiobook was that it is a serious book and there's a lot of horrific things, but it's also supposed to be really darkly funny about like office politics and the weird crap that happens in workplaces. And I thought that the way, I don't know, the stance, I don't know how Bronson would describe it, but the way the entry point, whatever distance he took, whether that was near or far from the character and the way he was saying things allowed for it to be both serious and funny without changing anything with it being consistent, just like it's supposed to be in the book. And that's what I thought would be difficult there. But there's also a lot of stuff in Authority that I really loved reading out loud at readings for the book. There are turns of phrase, there are conversations that are just so ridiculous that I really enjoyed saying them aloud. With Ambergris, you know, as a younger writer, and also with the influences involved, there's a kind of Baroque quality to a lot of the language that I wasn't sure how that would translate to audiobook, even though I knew that there's also in some places a cadence that came from having started out as a poet. But then also, you know, I didn't start thinking about reading my work aloud until almost like the third book in this series. Like, and that I think changes how you come back to your own fiction. So I guess that was one thing, is that how, and Bronson mentioned the exposition, which is often always also character and plot, in part because the city is a character. And it's so important for the characters to be kind of like encrusted with the city or encumbered by the city. But then how does that come across in an audiobook, let alone on the printed page? So I guess those were the things I was thinking about. All I knew that it would
Great
be
about audiobooks, and you and I were talking about this before we, you know, live, is that you really do, when you're lucky, when we are lucky as authors and artists and storytellers, that the audiobook actually gives you a flavor you may not have known was there. Then the audiobook is in addition to, it's not just, well, I'm on, you know, I'm on a long car trip to San Jose, I guess I'll listen to this book instead of reading it. Or I've always wanted to kind of dip into this, but I didn't have time, so I guess. But what you get in a book like Ambergris is, if a character is long-winded, then you get to stuff a lot in, because certain people who are long-winded or cerebral think in big chunks, and then you can do it rather breezily, because that's what people who are uber cerebral do. Whereas when you're reading it, you may try to parse it responsibly, which is a bad word for art. But so that's what you get. That's what you get in an audiobook that isn't different from, but it's just maybe a little flavor, like when lasagna sits in the refrigerator all night and it gets better, and it's not because of any one ingredient, it's just because it transformed a little.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I my computer just died, so I went downstairs to Ann's computer. So this is where I'm going to be now.
Hi.
It wasn't just for surreal effect or anything, but anyway.
See, Jeff and I are actually in the same house. You probably didn't know that, but now the secret's out. So I think.
So what's the next question, honey?
Okay.
Wouldn't it be? Wait a minute.
Sorry.
Wouldn't it truly be delightful, though, because there's a big hole in between you, if I just appeared in between you? and then three people from the bookstore hook up, and we could just nobody was, oh God, but I love that.
Oh my God.
Ann VanderMeer-ish.
Yeah, it does actually. Kind of reached right in VanderMeer,
But I do think that now is probably a good time, and Jeff is going to read an excerpt from Ambergris, and then we're going to play Bronson's a piece from Bronson's reading of Ambergris. So we're going to start with Jeff.
Yeah, but I'm going to read a shorter bit, and then we'll, so that there's some surprise to just what's being said, even though there'll also be a surprise at the heightened level of quality once we hear the audiobook version. And so this is from the early history of Ambergris, which is in City of Saints, and it's basically this historian that we already have kind of alluded to, the one who's inflicting the footnotes, talking about the history of the city, and in particular the formation of the city, and the ruler Manzikert and his priest confidant going on an expedition underground, which is where the mushroom people are, for reasons that are too complicated to get into in a summary here, but that's, I think, enough context for you. And I'm just going to read the bit where the historian excerpts Tonsure's journal of the account. And then you'll get some of the framing and the footnotes, the delicious footnotes from Bronson's audiobook thing when we do it. So, and this is also meant to be both scary, this part, but also supposed to be a send up of pulp fiction about weird underground places. So we wonder now if there ever were such a dream as above ground, or if this place has always been the reality and we simply deluding ourselves. We shamble through this darkness, through the foul emanations of the fungus, like lost souls in the netherworld. Together, Today we beseech them to end it, for we could hear, don't do that. For we could hear their laughter all around us, could glimpse the shadows of their passage, and we are past fear. End it, do not toy with us. It is clear enough now that here on their territory, the gray caps are our masters. I looked over my notes from last night and giggled at my innocence. Now see, that's where the send-up comes. I mean, you don't say giggled if you want. Anyway, degenerate traces of a once great civilization indeed. We have passed through so many queer and ominous chambers filled with otherworldly buildings, otherworldly sights, the wonders I have seen, luminous purple mushrooms pulsing in the darkness, creatures that can only be seen when they smile, for their skin reflects their surroundings, eyeless, pulsating salamanders that slowly ponder the dead darkness through other senses, winged animals that speak in voices, headless things that whisper our names, and ever and always the gray caps. We have even spied upon them at play, although only because they disdain us so, and seen the monuments carved from solid rock that beggar the buildings above ground. What I would give for a single breath of fresh air. Manzikert resists even these fancies. He has become sullen, responding to my words with grunts and clicks and whistles. More disturbing still, we have yet to retrace our steps. Thus, this underground land must be several times larger than the above-ground city, much as the submerged portion of an iceberg is larger than the part visible to a sailor. In my defense, I can give a much better reading, but it's also quite dark down here.
I have to say, I found that very hypnotic. I found that very, very, very hypnotic. And I saw it all. And that's not just because I've already read it. I thought that was rather wonderful and weirdly elegiac.
Well, there is, that's the thing also about the pulp fiction, that it's kind of like, I think, like Clark Ashton Smith, that it's kind of like referring to, is that there is that sense of kind of like wonder, even with the horror, and a sense of that cadence, which almost at times feels like it is religious to some degree.
Yeah,
religious about the unknown, maybe, I don't know. So that's what it's trying to go for. Even at the same time, it's sending it up in some cases. There are large portions of the book that I feel can be read as either very serious or can be read as kind of, not satire, but something akin to that. So.
See, the funny thing about your work is that one never needs to one never needs to decide what genre one is going to nod to, because if you play it straight, then it leans, it's like a bicycle on a tightrope. It leans left and it leans right. You don't need to give it anything. And then people afterwards say, oh, wow, it had all these colors. How did you? And it's like, yeah, well, because I just balanced on the tightrope, and it naturally kind of, you jiggle right, you jiggle left. But that's that kind of writing. So that's nice. Because some books you get and they're so, oh gosh, monochromatic and kind of predictable that you have to think to yourself, all right, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do with this? It's kind of like vegan pizza. What am I gonna do with it?
Well,
other stuff is so rich. You just say, just toe the line. But anyway.
Well, I mean, and we got to play the audiobook, but I would just say briefly that the books that I love are the ones that change when I reread them.
Yeah.
that may even seem completely different in mood in places. And so when I write, I'm always thinking, maybe it's a layering thing after, maybe it's part of the initial impulse. How can, how is this both this immediate reading experience, and how is this something that when you come back to it, maybe has some pull? So, but.
Hell yeah.
Okay, so I think now is a good time for us to hear the clip.
All right, I'm gonna get it going here.
We've got to mute ourselves, if you remember.
Yeah.
Tonsure then describes the deaths of the men still with the captain and Tonsure, 2 by poisoned mushrooms, 2 by blow dart, and 1 by a trap set into the ground that cut the man's legs off and left him to bleed to death. Now it is just the captain and Tonsure, and somehow Tonsure has recovered his nerve. We wonder now if there ever were such a dream as above ground, or if this place has always been the reality and we simply deluding ourselves. We shamble through this darkness, through the foul emanations of the fungus like lost souls in the netherworld. Today we beseeched them to end it, for we could hear their laughter all around us, could glimpse the shadows of their passage, and we are past fear. End it. Do not toy with us. It is clear enough now that here on their territory, they are our masters. I looked over my notes last night and giggled at my innocence. Degenerate traces of a once great civilization, indeed. We have passed through so many queer and ominous chambers filled with otherworldly buildings, otherworldly sights. The wonders I have seen. Luminous purple mushrooms pulsing in the darkness, creatures that can only be seen when they smile, for their skin reflects their surroundings. Eyeless, pulsating, blind salamanders that slowly ponder the dead darkness through other senses. Winged animals that speak in voices. Headless things that whisper our names. And ever and always the gray caps. We have even spied upon them at play, although only because they disdain us so, and seen the monuments carved from solid rock that beggar the buildings above ground. What I would give for a single breath of fresh air. Manzikert resists even these fancies. He has become sullen, responding to my words with grunts and clicks and whistles. More disturbing still, we have yet to retrace our steps. Thus, this underground land must be several times larger than the above-ground city, much as the submerged portion of an iceberg is larger than the part visible to a sailor. Clearly, however, Tonsure never regained his time sense, for on this day, marked by him as the 6th, Manzikert would already have been 5 days above ground. Eyeless, but alive. Perhaps Tonsure deluded himself that Manzikert remained by his side to strengthen his own resolve. Or perhaps the fringe historians have for once been too conservative. Instead of a golem Manzikert being returned to the surface, perhaps the underground Manzikert was replaced with a golem. Tonsure certainly never tells us what happened to Manzikert. His entries simply do not mention him after approximately the 9th day. By the 12th day, the entries become somewhat disjointed, and the last coherent entry before the journal dissolves into fragments is this pathetic paragraph. They're coming for me. They've had their fun. Now they'll finish me. To my mother, I have always tried to be your obedient son. To my illegitimate son and his mother, I have always loved you, although I didn't always know it. To the world that may read this, know that I was a decent man, that I meant no harm, that I lived a life far less pious than I should have, but far better than many. May God have mercy on my soul. Footnote 115. Then as now, bastards were a cell a dozen among the clergy. How much more interesting to know where this mother and child resided. Nicaea, perhaps? And yet apparently they did not finish him. Footnote 116. Saban dryly writes, Tonsure was already the most finished man in the history of the world. How then could they improve upon perfection? For another 150 pages of writing follows this entry. These 150 pages,
That was
You see
great,
what?
though. In part because Tonsure, of course, is serious to himself, but I find wickedly funny that he talks to his mother, but then also to the mother of his illegitimate child right after that. I
You
find
see
that to be kind of
this
funny.
is what I was talking about, that that is on offer in an audiobook, is that you have three, at least, super distinct narrative voices here. You've got Duncan Shriek, the author. You've got Tonsure inside Duncan's narrative, but distinct from it. And then you've got Duncan's footnotes, which are clearly meant to sound outside the whole thing. So there's those three at least, and there may be more, but that's something you only get, you know, as I was saying to you before we went live, as a reader, you see the number of the footnote and then you look down and then you go back up. But as a listener, what you just get is the tonal shift. You get Duncan the author, and then you get Duncan the bitchy annotator. One thing that I was hoping would be in there that wasn't is, I can't remember how many footnotes there are total, but what I did in, how many? What?
How many you want to know? I'll keep talking, but I'll find it.
Anyway, what I did, which I loved, because I just thought it was, is that Duncan himself realized he'd bitten off more than he could chew. So I always said footnote 113, footnote 114, and toward the end, I think it was in the 130s.
Yeah, that's where it ends. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had him say footnote 132. Like, what did I get myself into? What have I committed to? Which
that's great.
You know, because he says at the beginning, I'm putting them in to make sure that nobody takes any liberties with me. But then toward the end, I was like, what have I done? So anyway,
that's awesome, though. It is.
Well, Jeff, this is the first time that you've heard this. Mm-hmm. So what do you think of Bronson?
I thought it was great. I mean, the layering is the thing that I don't necessarily attempt in a reading of something unless I've done it a few times live. You know what I'm saying? Like I generally, before I perfect a reading, I'm going to do it a few times before the book release date if I have some event, and get a sense of what the audience reaction is too. So if I were to continue to read that portion, there would be more of that coming in, and I'd probably steal a lot of what you did, because I really love, especially how the footnotes sounded. And then I think it's actually really difficult to read rich descriptive prose like the excerpt, and really have it sound mysterious and kind of unnerving. Because for me, I'm always worried about, am I going to misstep over this word or that word? And I thought it was great. In fact, one thing that I'm planning on doing is listening to the audiobook, because this material is also so familiar to me, because it's the earliest stuff that I wrote, basically. And so it's very hard for me to kind of like see it. So I thought it would be very interesting to listen to the audiobook. And that'd be another kind of form of debriefing. You know, every time a book's out, I tend to kind of like go back and look at the book, think about what I could have done differently or what I can apply to the next book. So that was great. That was really great.
One thing that I have learned myself reading, I'm about at 400 books, and wow. What I have said a million times to young engineers especially is, my God, if authors would just ask a friend to read back a chapter to them, they'd see everything they need to see, because there are things that, you know, you just don't know until you've heard it. You can tell. A lot of times, not at all with you, but with some authors, you say at the end of a book that's 10 finished hours, I'll say, my God, there's an amazing 3-hour novella, really, really good, buried in this 10 hours of material. And it's not that the 10 hours isn't good or worthwhile, but you think, my God, if they culled that 3 hours, but I don't think it's their fault. I think that if they just asked a friend, just read it to me, you can tell, I mean, you could tell in a second, I said it, and now I don't need to say it again, or I don't need to say it again right now, unless, as we say, Duncan, who makes an art of overstating and continually beating the dead horse of where he thinks Saban went wrong, and this, that, the other, and those little touches and
That's what
colors.
he's obsessed with. Yes.
Yeah,
It's kind of
you know,
the problem of the form. But the other thing is, I think that sometimes there's also an element to performance. So like Stephen King, I saw him read, and I can rarely listen to a reading more than 20 minutes, you know, live without beginning to drift a bit. And he held me for an hour, and I was like, how did he do that? And then it turned out that the novella he was reading, he edited for reading aloud. So it was not
sure.
the same as the written version. And I do that with my readings. I often go through and edit the novel. But what I'm getting at is that I often wish that the person who is doing the audiobook would have the leeway to make changes as they, you know what I'm saying? Because I feel like there is something to it being read aloud that lends itself to making some changes to the written text. And I don't know how you feel about
What
that.
do you think about that, Bronson?
Here's what I say. I remember I love to do musicals. I love to sing, and I was away from musicals for a full 10 years, during which I was doing audiobooks the whole time. And I went back, this was about 3 years ago, and I'd been off stage with musicals for 3 years. And I said to the musical director, oh my God, I haven't sung a note in all these years, and I'm really terrified. And he said, let's give the company some dance to learn, and let's you and me go and work in the other room. And it took about 21 minutes, and my voice, I was singing just like I wanted to. And I said, what in the world? And he said, that doesn't happen, except I think that it's the audiobooks that have kept your breath, your consciousness of your breath. What I love about musicals and about reading audiobooks is people always say, it's a cliche now, oh, make it your own, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. But in audiobooks, I think I told you this in an email once, if a character is cold or has a stutter and is saying, but Jeff and I, please, they will, the quality control will literally count the number of the J's in Jeff and but, and they'll send it back if you do it 4 times instead of 3 or 3 times instead of 4. And after you get over your initial outrage, you start to love the confines of it. And it's the same with doing Shakespeare. It's the same with musicals. You know, going in, there is no changing it to quote unquote make it comfortable in your mouth. And then you realize, of course, I can make it. I can make myself suit it. So when you had said to me in an early email, which I just had to smile because they're so strict about everybody, about all authors, you said, oh, you know, you can change it. And I thought, in a pig's eye, because their feeling is because it's been published, and because people that get the audiobook may want it as a memento of a book they loved, you may not change a word. Even there was a thing once, it was a book about Alexander the Great, and it was something he said in ancient Greek, and it was wrong, and I said, this is incorrect. And they said, that, do you read it anyway? And I said, but it's good. It says my name on it, and I love ancient Greek history, and this means I'm putting my stamp of approval on the incorrect. And they said, that's correct. Just do it. And you know, it's a great discipline in a way. You know, you can see in great old movies. Have you ever seen Captain's Courageous? And Spencer Tracy does an appalling Portuguese accent, but an absolutely brilliant character. And so I wouldn't reshoot it and say, or redub it and say, let's get a better Portuguese accent. It's Spencer Tracy's attempt at a Portuguese accent. It's one of the great performances in film. And it's not it's not an ideal Portuguese accent, but it is a spectacular characterization, you know?
Should we open up to questions?
Maybe, and then the last question for us at the end.
I think what we're going to do now is open up to some audience questions, and then I'll do a final question to y'all before we finish. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, so Jeremy's got some questions.
Yeah, we've got a few here, and you still have time to put some in here, audience, if you think of anything. Well, this first one, I just want to, Bronson, it's to you, and you covered a lot of this, but if you have anything else you'd like to say, did you find any striking similarities or contrasts between narrating Authority and narrating Ambergris? Like you talked about that, but.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is, and I've said this to only two authors in my life. One is Mr. VanderMeer, and one is Tim Powers. After a voyage through one of their books, you feel that you deserve and need a week in a hammock in the Bahamas, because nothing is ever, there's no autopilot and there's no cruise control. You have to stay engaged, because they stay engaged with every gritty little twist and turn of experience. Neither one of them, and it's all this lore too. That's the other thing you two have in common, this lore that you have carved out of living rock, and you've got to stay alert to it. Whereas some books, it's like, oh, the handsome hero, yeah, and he's just seen the cute nurse, so now I know I need to lay in a little bit of flirtation because it's clear they're going to, but that's not the case here. So one is simply exhausted at the end, really truly mentally exhausted, and your brain feels like literally like you've done too many bicep curls and you need to maybe put your brain in an ice pack for 2 weeks and have fluids.
Use that as a blurb.
I think that would be a great blurb. I had to put my brain in an ice pack after doing VanderMeer's book.
Well, that's the thing. You need to stay engaged. You can't ever guess, and you don't want to guess, but you can't ever guess where it's going. And it's that's a great thing. That's great. That's what, that's great.
All right. Well, it looks like we have another panelist that just showed up there.
Sorry.
So,
Neo was complaining we weren't paying enough attention to him.
Okay. After returning to Ambergris to put together the new edition, were there things that surprised you in reading it years later in light of your more recent work? Did this experience, looking back on your previous work, impart any lessons that you might apply to future writing?
Well, I think there's been a progression in how I was writing at first when I read Angela Carter. I think some of the early works in City of Saints are also kind of influenced by that and feminism, in the sense of exploring messed up men. And then there's a progression from that towards also incorporating more I guess strong or prominent women characters as I go along. There's also a progression from what you might call a more Boschian or Baroque style at times to being a little more flexible. And in a weird way, Duncan's voice allowed me to do that because of the sarcasm and the grumpiness. And then I think in rereading them, I did make edits this time. There was some terminology that seemed out of date or has been updated that made sense to change, and others that didn't. There were parts in like Transformation of Martin Lake where I felt like I was signaling a point too hard. So most of what I did is I cut things here and there, where it's obvious that the theme was showing, and it shouldn't be showing. It should be the subtext. I don't know. It's hard. It's hard for me. Like, when I said at the beginning about the publication history, it's hard for me sometimes to divorce the books from that, because I feel like some of that is in the later books disguised, and some of the like things like the war between the publishing houses and whatnot is kind of like where that came out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, they're just their own thing, and I think there's some environmental stuff in there, but it's not as overt. In part because the urban themes are and the historical stuff is what interested me the most. I mean, I really invested heavily in becoming an amateur expert on Byzantine history and Venetian history, and trying to really study different kinds of historical theory, and then finding ways to put that in the books that I thought was interesting. So I don't know. They're just different from the later work in some ways.
All right. I'll ask two more and then hand it over to you, Ann. Does that sound good? Well, just one. Please show us the omnibus edition. So there you go.
Where? Oh, fun.
And then let's see. Jeff, one of the things I love about your writing is you paint with a broad emotional palette. Why do some speculative fiction authors tend to stick with a more limited emotional palette, or is my perception off?
You want me to slag other authors?
Well, no, I think what they're getting at is, with a lot of, I guess, to use the terminology, hard sci-fi, they focus more on the idea than the emotional resonance of the characters. And is that because of what you like to write more that you build into?
I guess the answer is more about what I believe about character and setting, for example. Like I believe once I'm in a character's point of view, whether it's first person or a third person, that any detail I'm sharing about the setting is really coming through their point of view. And so sometimes the emotional resonance comes from the fact that fairly mundane objects or settings have become imbued with the emotion of the characters. I think one good example is in Finch, where I had the choice in the third book of Ambergris series of starting out with a description of the city with this detective who's being forced to work for the Greycaps, and then getting into the murder mystery, or have him first encounter the murder and the tension of having to deal with his superiors, and then he walks out onto a balcony and he sees the city. The difference there is that the reader has had the time to process who these characters are, what's meaningful to them, and then when he's looking out across the city, he's looking out across the city as it was when he knew it before it was broken and conquered. So there's that overlay, that emotional overlay over the setting. So those buildings and the things he's seeing have a deep and rich and heartbreaking meaning to him in a way that they wouldn't if they had appeared at the very beginning. Even though if they'd appeared at the beginning, they also would have orientated the reader as to the setting. So those are the kinds of things that I think about when creating emotional resonance. And I can't speak for how anyone else does it. I just know that if an image isn't somehow emotionally resonant, if it's something that's recurring, then I'm not really doing my job, if that makes any sense. So even stuff that seems like background furniture often comes into play.
Great. And we'll end on this one, and I'll turn it back over to you, Ann. Now that you have your authoritative complete edition, are you feeling the urge to write any more Ambergris stories?
I have one incomplete one, Zamalon file, that I may complete. Mostly I want to do a graphic novel that's set 20 years after Finch, because it has like 14 viewpoint characters, and I feel like the cinematic approach is really the only way to convey that. I don't think I want to write a novel with 14 or 15 viewpoint characters, but I want a floating camera eye over all of them. And not being a filmmaker, but knowing how to do a comic script at least, I feel like I could have some control over what that looks like. So basically what I'm saying is that because I am crap at thinking in terms of film, and I love graphic novels, that's what I would turn to if I ever did any more Ambergris stuff, just because the scope of it requires it, and the novel form doesn't seem like the right, seems limiting for this particular project. So.
Can I jump in with a short story?
Yes.
This is my favorite of all time. Vignette of what it's like to record and you just because you were talking about an unfinished work. There was a wonderful French book that ends in the interior monologue of a character who has been stabbed mortally and goes back up to, he's an art dealer, and he struggles back up to his art studio, and he's dying of blood loss, and he's dragging himself across the floor. And as he loses more and more blood, he's becoming more and more, you know, disoriented. And he's looking at a painting of a landscape, and he kind of can't tell anymore if he's in the room or in the landscape. And then the book ends in the middle of a sentence because he's died. And the entire last page of the book is about a third, you know, text. And then the sentence breaks off, and then there's a blank page, and that's how you know he's died. And it came back from the 19-year-old proofreader with the note, "Thought seems unfinished." Isn't that out of this world?
It is.
Gotta love them. Gotta love them. Well, Bronson, speaking about writing, I understand that you are working on a novel as well. Can you tell us a little bit about it, and also how your work in other areas has influenced your own writing?
Well, I will say that I started to write this book in 2006, and it was a good way along. When I started to do audiobooks nearly full time in 2009, and I have to say that the experience of reading stuff, of course, it's set in an alternate universe, and it's this, that, and the other thing, but the experience of reading stuff aloud and saying, "Holy God, we know that already. We heard that. We've seen that," or we get it. We get, you know, don't get, you know, and in acting, it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
We love in film where there's a close up of a face and the person is about to cry. We like that actually less than someone just sobbing snot, because it just leads you. The drawbridge comes down, and then you get to walk over. Somebody doesn't yank you over. So the audiobooks have really, you know, then I would go home and strike a, you know, just take a cleaver and hack off half a chapter, because I'd already said it, even though I had a pretty way of saying it. But that's what, you know, then now I go to a diner with a friend who's a narrator, and I say, "Let me hear this." And then I just open up my throat with a knife when I realize I've written the same thing 3 times. But but that's, you know, because as we all know, all stories up until about 750 BC were orally transmitted, and it's the damn invention of writing that's made people get precious, because, you know, up till then it was as much as you could memorize. But I think that's absolutely key, is get a friend to read it aloud, and when you start to writhe, cut.
Well, Jeff, one last question for you. The audiobook brings Ambergris to life in a different way than the text does, but you have also recorded Ambergris stories and created found objects from the city. Would you talk a little bit about other things that Ambergris has sprung?
Yeah, like I actually recorded a short story set in Ambergris that was like a found object. It actually came in originally in the printed form in a little booklet in a little box with mushrooms and little memory capsules to help you protect your identity during the Festival of the Freshwater Squid. And I sent that out to people who had bought it, but also reviewers. But I made the mistake of packing it in cooking mushrooms. So most of the reviewers who got the packages thought that they'd been sent mushrooms and just either tossed the whole thing out, or some of them called me and thought that I had sent them magic mushrooms and were mad at me. So I did things like that, where I was trying to like make Ambergris real in the world. And part of that is the soundtracks that exist too. There's one called Fungicide by Robert Devereaux, an experimental album for City of Saints. The rock band The Church did an album for Shriek, which also has them doing basically some spoken word of excerpts from the novel over music in addition to the songs. And Murder by Death did one for Finch, where they did this incredible thing where there's a scene in Finch where there's an underground band using instruments like they're hitting a trash can lid with with a rock or something to make a sound, and they actually made a song using only the instruments that are described in that scene. It sounds amazing.
I like that.
Yeah, that was pretty amazing, and I still write to some of this music as background. There's also a Shriek film, of which only remains now a trailer, a short film that turned out to be a little bit of a debacle. It was very popular in Berlin when it debuted, which because there were a lot of people who were very serious about avant-garde filmmaking, it made me a little nervous because mostly the film was strange clouds with narration over it, and and it didn't seem like it was really what we had expected. But there's a trailer out there that looks a little bit like Eraserhead that you can still find for the Shriek book. So there's some.
This is what I was talking about earlier, that nobody needs to out VanderMeer. You need to get. No, but that sounds like the problem. The thing is, if you as the interpretist, which is what French people call actors, which I love, if you as the interpretist don't try to give it clouds, and you just, there's so much flavor in it already, there's so much atmospheric soup already, that if you play the role of the straight man, everybody thinks it's got all this flavor and atmosphere because they're smelling the flavor and atmosphere that you put there. If you give it flavor and atmosphere, then what have you got?
It's a good
You've
question.
got, you know what I mean? That's exactly the wrong thing to do with your stuff. I would, that's wrong, says he on his couch.
Somewhere on some backup, I've got a copy of it.
Yeah.
I've got to find it. So last question to wrap this up, which is always my last question. What is on the horizon for you? What are you working on? What can we see in the future? What's going on? What's coming?
Oh, well, just a bunch of audiobooks and my book at the moment that I know of. Although I may be playing a Nazi, which is marvelous, but I'm not sure yet.
Okay. Okay. Jeff, how about you?
Well, I have a novel coming out in April called Hummingbird Salamander. I'm tempted to say there'll be a sequel called Platypus Alligator, but no. But I really do like the title Hummingbird Salamander, and there are actually a hummingbird and a salamander in it, which would be false advertising if there wasn't. But it's basically an eco thriller set about 10 seconds into the future. It's basically the present day, about this woman who's a security analyst who is given a taxidermed hummingbird by a dead eco-terrorist, and she doesn't know why, and she kind of falls down a rabbit hole of trying to figure it out. And by the time she figures out that she probably shouldn't have investigated it, it's a little bit too late. So it just allows me to explore more directly some of the themes that are in the prior books. But because the mystery is all wound up in those things, it's not like it's a didactic book. It's a pretty fast-paced thriller. So I'm excited about that one.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Bronson.
Thanks so
Jeff?
much.
Jeremy,
Thank you so much. That was so much fun.
That was,
I also
wasn't it?
want to thank all of the people that joined us, that are listening in on this and having a good time with us. I appreciate that. You could have been doing anything else on a Monday night, right?
And I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Bronson.
Thank you.
It was fun.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that